In 1916, a young woman by the name of Rasmine Jensen finds herself in distress. She is recently divorced, which means she is the sole provider for her 3-week-old son. Rasmine makes the difficult decision to give away her baby for adoption. At the time, it seems to be the best solution for both her and the child. The hope is that a family with more money may be able to give the boy a better life. She quickly finds a listing in the papers. A local woman is graciously offering to adopt children in exchange for payment. This isn't odd around this time. In fact, there are a number of different notices from ladies looking for adoption opportunities to choose from, but Rasmine eventually settles on one, taking the woman up on her offer after agreeing to a fee. On April 15th, she kisses the boy one final time, then hands him over. But if she knew what this woman was about to do, she would likely have reconsidered this decision. After collecting her payment, the woman wheels the boy around in a stroller for a while, but then she takes him to a cemetery where she proceeds to strangle him to death and discards his body in a public latrine. 3 days later, the body of the child is found at a waste treatment facility across town, and the police put notices in all the major papers in order to identify the boy, but no one ever comes to claim the infant. This murder is the first in a string of horrifying killings by the same woman over the next few years. In 1921, she was finally convicted of the murders of 9 children, which makes her the most prolific serial killer in Danish history. And this number doesn't even consider the additional 7 murders she confessed to while being questioned. Today, I'm going to talk about a historic case of one of Denmark's most terrifying killers, whose unclear motives still leave people baffled to this day. This is the story of Dagmar Overby, whom the papers later gave the nickname the Angel Maker. My goal with this channel is to talk about some of the most horrifying crimes from around Northern Europe, and there are a lot to pick from. I'm from Denmark myself, and I know of so many cases from around my nation that most people from other places have never heard of. And whether it's terrifying murders, baffling disappearances, or unexplained mysteries, those are the stories that I want to share with you. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. For now, let's get on with today's story. Dagmar Overby was born in 1887 as one of 6 children into a poor family. But in 1916, when our story begins, she is 29 years old and finds herself living in Copenhagen with her daughter Irena and her boyfriend Svend, a lazy ne'er-do-well who drinks a bit too much. Denmark remains neutral during World War I, but life is still challenging in the dirty city. While the last 50 years of industrialization has generated more jobs, and the emergence of labor unions have greatly improved people's lives, Dagmar was recently forced to close the candy shop she had run for the last year, and her partner Svend has been fired from his job as a delivery driver. It becomes increasingly clear that it falls on her to sort out their personal finances. And it's around this time that she has an idea. Dagmar has heard about women taking in other people's children in exchange for money. The authorities have rules for this, but it's very easy to get around these. There seems to be a bit of a market for it as well. Children out of wedlock are very much frowned upon, and this arrangement gives unfortunate young mothers the opportunity to preserve their dignity. This is what leads Dagmar to adopt Rasmine Jensen's son in April of 1916. After she wheels the boy away, her heart is likely pounding. The idea had seemed so simple only a few days earlier, but now that she has this infant to provide for, Dagmar slowly begins to panic. She starts to question her decision. In fact, she hasn't even spoken to Svend about it, and she's afraid of what he might say when she comes home with another person's baby. That's why, as she wheels the stroller around the cemetery, she suddenly finds herself reaching down and suffocating the small boy. She looks around for a way to discard the body, and when she sees the public bathrooms, she quickly stuffs it in the bins with human waste. When Dagmar comes home, she tells her boyfriend Sven to sell the stroller, and he seemingly doesn't ask where she got it. The killing of Rasmine's son is Dagmar's first documented murder. It's hard to really understand her frame of mind at the time. It's a fact, however, that after struggling to make a living for a while, she suddenly has a pocket full of money. And motivated by this, she puts another ad in the papers. Dagmar meets another young mother who needs to find a home for her baby. And after they agree on the fee, the child is handed over. But this baby also didn't live much longer. Dagmar later testified in court that she was again stricken by panic. When she got back to her apartment, she strangled the baby girl to death, then wrapped her body in some old rags and shoved it underneath her bed. The next day, she tossed the remains in a sewer drain. Next, she met a lady who had a baby with a much older co-worker. This time, they agreed to a monthly payment. Dagmar took the young boy's life as soon as she returned to her apartment, but she continued to collect these scheduled payments all the way until January of 1917. Her landlord started to question this money that was coming in, but she explained that it was being sent by her daughter Irena's father in Jutland, and this seemed to satisfy his curiosity. Dagmar began to use a different alias each time she placed an ad, and this is likely why no one noticed the frequency of her adoptions. And it also appears that Sven wasn't aware of Dagmar's misdeeds. The fourth time she took in another person's baby, for some unclear reason, she decided to not kill him immediately. Perhaps the mental load of murdering 3 small infants had begun to catch up with her. Whatever the case may be, the baby boy became part of her family for a while, and it seems this enabled her to hide the truth. At times, the unsuspecting mothers would drop by to see their children, but Dagmar would simply pretend that this boy was any of the other babies she had murdered, and seemingly, no one questioned this ruse. Dagmar pounces yet again when the opportunity appears. Another mother delivers her child to the apartment and pays her a hefty fee, but the moment the lady leaves, Dagmar fills a tub with water and drowns the baby. She then drapes it in some old rags and hides it in a closet. Over the summer, the body begins to smell very bad, and eventually Sven notices, so Dagmar wraps it in a fresh set of linens, then shoves it underneath the floorboards in the attic. Next, a young woman responds to her ad, but this time Dagmar has to go pick up the baby at a clinic. The nurse tries to talk the mother out of giving up her son. She finds Dagmar both sloppy and unfit to be a caregiver, but the young woman is adamant that she needs to find a home for her child. So they agree on a payment, and Dagmar leaves with the infant. And at this point, you can probably guess what happened next. With the money in her pocket, Dagmar proceeds to strangle the baby boy to death, then covers him in a diaper and stuffs him in a suitcase. She, her daughter Irena, and the child that's still living with them travel across the country to Jutland the next day to visit Dagmar's parents, and when they get there, she pulls the remains out of her suitcase and buries them in a field behind a barn. But the proverbial hole that Dagmar is digging for herself seems to get deeper and deeper. Her father does not approve of her caring for another lady's child, and with a feeling of being overwhelmed by her spiraling life, she decides to give the boy back. She doesn't return him to his real mother, however. She goes to see Rasmine Jensen instead, the mother of the first child she killed. She explains he's unable to provide for the baby anymore, and she leaves the infant with the unsuspecting lady. Already by 1917, however, Dagmar finds herself in need of money, so she takes in yet another boy whom she also decides to let live. Part of this arrangement is a monthly fee, so one could speculate that Dagmar's decision not to kill him immediately was in part due to making sure the recurring payments would continue. While this boy lives with them, Dagmar carries on with her crimes. She takes in and kills another 3 young children, and this is when the murders take on another level of savagery. Their apartment has an old stove meant to keep the rooms heated in the colder months, but it also becomes an efficient way for Dagmar to discard the bodies of her victims. This act of burning the kids after she's killed them is later one of the gruesome facts that people best remember about the case. It's a terrifying idea, and it easily makes you think of the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel when the old witch tries to cook the children alive in her oven. Eventually, Dagmar is asked to move out by her landlord. Other residents had complained about items being stolen, and this, combined with Dagmar's odd behavior, meant that she and the family had to find another home. But they didn't have many options. Sven was serving some time in jail for petty crimes, so Dagmar decided to send a letter to her daughter's father, and the man agreed to let them move in with him. Dagmar had met Anton Nielsen long before her murderous spree had started, and for a brief time they had been married. Back then, she had been traveling the country, begging for work anywhere they needed a housekeeper, but she only stayed a short while at each home. Anton was in fact not Irena's real father, but Dagmar had listed him as the parent because they had been involved around the time she got pregnant. But as she, her daughter Irena, and the boy living with them travel across the country, the move quickly turns out to be a bad idea. Dagmar and Anton briefly rekindled their relationship, which had ended years earlier, but they fought like cats and dogs. Anton would savagely beat her anytime she refused to have sex with him. He later testified in court that she had developed an addiction to ether, and Dagmar had claimed she needed it to keep her mind sane. One day, both of them are arrested. They are accused of a number of thefts in the area, where livestock and farm animals have gone missing. Instead of the odd couple claiming to be innocent, they both decide to turn on each other and put the blame on the other person. This means they're both found guilty. Dagmar is sent back to Copenhagen, where she is to serve 15 months at a women's prison. Consequently, she loses her parental rights, and Irena and the boy are sent to live at an orphanage. While in jail, Dagmar meets a missionary from a religious charity organization, and this lady arranges a shared room for her upon her release. She also gets Dagmar a job at a factory. In August of 1919, she looks to adopt another child and make some money, so she puts an ad in the papers, and a young woman responds. They agree to a fee. Dagmar picks up the child from her home, then takes it to the room she's staying at, where she inevitably panics again and strangles the baby. After hiding the body under her bed for a few days, she takes it to a street called Øresundsvej in the Amager area of the city, where she stuffs it in a drain. The body is found sometime later, but again, the authorities are unable to identify it. Let me share with you that as I am recording this, I can see this street from my desk. It's only a short walk from my apartment. It was over 100 years ago, but it still makes you think. In 1919, life begins to catch up with Dagmar. She starts to get more and more depressed, and her addiction to ether is getting worse. After it becomes clear that she's unable to live up to the house rules at the charity, she is asked to move out, and she also gets fired from her job at the factory. But Dagmar soon finds work as a housekeeper at the home of a lady called Mrs. Mogensen. Mrs. Mogensen, however, is sick from diabetes, and surprisingly, she passes away soon after in January. Dagmar decides to take over the lease and continues to live there. If you feel that the timing of Mrs. Mogensen's death seems suspicious, given she unknowingly hired a murderer as her housekeeper only a short time earlier, you're not alone, as will be evident in a bit. Around this time, Dagmar puts her final ad in the papers, and she meets with a couple. They want to find someone to adopt their 6-month-old child, but before the boy is delivered to her, Dagmar's horrifying spree of murders comes to a final conclusion. In 1920, Dagmar meets with Caroline Aasen. Caroline needs someone to look after her 2-month-old daughter. They agree on the payment, but for some unclear reason, Dagmar later declines the money, which wasn't the first time she had done that. Caroline delivers the baby to her apartment, and shortly after she leaves, Dagmar strangles the girl to death then puts the body in the oven and starts the fire. She later claims in court that she had to leave the apartment because the stench was horrific. But meanwhile, Caroline begins to have doubts. Evidently, she changes her mind about giving the child away over the next few days, so she decides to go back and see Dagmar. When she appears at Dagmar's home, however, Dagmar claims that the girl is being watched by someone else for a bit, so Caroline is forced to leave without any sign of her daughter. She comes back several times later in the day. Dagmar leaves her apartment for some time, and when Caroline is finally able to catch her again, she demands to know where her child is, and Dagmar changes her story. She now claims to have given the baby to a stranger. Frantic, Caroline goes to see the police. But the situation is precarious. Society doesn't think highly of women that have children outside of marriage. But eventually she's able to convince the authorities that something is wrong. The police go to see Dagmar, and from the way she is behaving, they immediately suspect that she is under the influence of narcotics. They arrest her, and the next day she's charged with negligence. But they still haven't solved the mystery that brought them to Dagmar in the first place. Where is Caroline's baby? When pressed, Dagmar gives them permission to search her apartment, and when they examine the home, they find bone fragments in the ashes inside the stove. Forensic experts are not able to rule out that the bones are from a child, so these findings immediately force the police to intensify their investigation. Around the same time, they receive an anonymous letter suggesting they also take a closer look at the recent death of Dagmar's employer, Mrs. Mogensen. It seems at least one person doesn't think her passing had been natural. When they interrogate her, Dagmar finally makes a confession. At first, she tells them about the girl she killed and hid underneath the floorboards in the attic of her old apartment. And when the police go to investigate the scene, they find the decaying remains of a child. The next day, Dagmar confesses to killing Rasmine Jensen's son, whom she had discarded in the latrine in the cemetery. And this seems to open the floodgates. The police listen in horror as Dagmar tells them more and more stories of mothers who have left their children with her in exchange for payment, only for her to find ways of getting rid of the babies after the fact. She is taken to several locations around the city to help retrieve the bodies of her victims, but in multiple cases, they are unable to find the remains. During the investigation, the police also learned that Dagmar had given birth to another child after she had her daughter years earlier, but the man she was with at the time didn't want anything to do with them. So after Dagmar had given birth to the baby boy alone in a dark room, she had taken the newborn to a nearby barn where she had abandoned him. As the historically massive scope of the case slowly dawns on them, the police begin interviewing anyone Dagmar has ever been acquainted with. They talk to her family, her siblings, and her parents. Details from her childhood emerge, and everything they learn seems to paint the same picture of a woman who is a notorious liar and has no qualms preying on other people whenever she sees an opportunity. She got in trouble a lot when she was a child, and she was beaten for it, and supposedly, her grandfather sexually abused her when she was little. The family only had fleeting encounters with Dagmar for the last few years, yet they were still surprised that she could have done what the investigators were saying that she did. For a while, Dagmar was interrogated almost daily. She was never able to explain why she did what she did. All she said was that she felt an immense grief after every one of her kills. After a while, she would begin to question if the murders had even happened. She claimed that she never deliberately planned to kill the children, and she somehow didn't understand what she had done until it had been too late. In November of 1920, she suddenly broke down during one of her interrogations and began crying. She eventually lost consciousness, and a doctor had to be called, who determined that she had suffered a mental break. Because of this, the prosecutor believed they should have someone perform a psychological evaluation of her. Such examinations were not very common at the time, but a professor at the public hospital agreed to do it. Dr. August Wimmer, a seasoned psychiatric specialist, wrote an 18-page report which minutiously explored his conversations with Dagmar. In his opinion, the regret she expressed over the murders seemed superficial. Truly, Dagmar was a lot more obsessed with the idea that everyone in her life had abandoned her, and let her down. She claimed that her addiction to narcotics was to blame for the murders, but Dr. Wimmer dismissed this as her trying to excuse her crimes. In fact, he concluded that she had acted with a great deal of planning and premeditation, and the frequency of the murders didn't give him the impression that she had any lasting feelings of regret about her terrible actions. His final determination was that nothing in Dagmar's past could explain nor excuse her horrific crimes. So why did she do it? Clearly, the opportunity for enrichment was present, but in several instances, Dagmar declined the payment from the mothers. And it's this fact that still puzzles people to this day. Were the murders really her way of exacting some sort of revenge on a cruel society which had only offered her a life of misery? After a trial that lasted several days, the jury only needed a short time to deliberate. On March 3, 1921, they sentenced her to death. She was found guilty of all 9 murders, and she decided to not appeal the decision. The last time, however, that a woman had been executed in Denmark had been more than 50 years earlier, in 1861. There was a growing opposition to the death penalty in society, so it wasn't unexpected when her sentence was commuted a month later, and she was given life imprisonment instead. But this lesser punishment was conditional. Dagmar would never be able to get out on parole. She served her sentence at the women's prison in Copenhagen. It's the same jail she had been in only a few years prior. But as it would turn out, she didn't have to suffer the confines of prison for much longer. Dagmar Overby died in her cell in 1929 at the age of 42. There are some people who feel bad for Dagmar. She was tossed around by life, growing up in poverty and misery, having to travel across the country to find work, and being abused and mistreated by every man she met. And her early life is a tragic reminder of a time when life was a lot harder for an unmarried single mother with no money. It's not hard to see how this could have turned her into a monster. But remember, this monster didn't hide in the closet. It killed children and burned them. And to this day, she is still the most prolific serial killer in Danish history, if you look at the number of her victims. The media were quick to label Dagmar as a psychopath. They pushed the story that she at one point had an entire house full of children, whom she would ritualistically kill one by one. They nicknamed her the Angel Maker because these children were all young infants who had never done anything to deserve their horrific fate, and this made Dagmar's home the Angel Factory. But the police saw the case a bit differently. Interestingly, they put a lot of blame on the system. No one should have been able to do what Dagmar did for so long without being discovered. The authorities should have put an end to her adoptions. The system needed to change, and eventually it did. In 1924, the first law was passed mandating a public registry of all people born in Denmark, and subsequent legislation was put in place that drastically improved the oversight of babies in foster care or those born outside of marriage, rules that remained effective and unchanged until at least 1965 and ensured the well-being of thousands of children. Society changes at a slow pace, and unfortunately, it sometimes takes a monster to make it move faster. This is it for today's story. If you have made it this far, don't forget to give us a like. And if you don't want to miss any of our future episodes, make sure to subscribe. In our next installment, I plan on exploring a much more recent murder case from the year 2000, which lives much more vividly in people's memory. And trust me, it's not a case for the faint of heart. Until next time, thank you for watching.